Just give me a second while it enables. Great. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to have such a big audience here today for my workshop on creative writing. Now, as I said, this meeting will be recorded and uploaded over the weekend, but while you're listening, feel free to take any notes that you find useful, or if you think of any questions, hold them until the end. I have saved a little bit of time for me to answer some questions. Now, first of all, just a little bit of an introduction of myself for anyone who isn't familiar with me. My name is Chewy Wang. I'm currently in my final year of law at the University of Sydney. Next year, I'll be working at the Fair Work Commission. And throughout high school, I was very good at English, and I actually came first in the state for English Advanced during my HSC year, which was 2017. I've been teaching now at Cogito for almost 5 whole years, teaching a lot of creative writing, persuasive writing, and other English-related activities such as debating. Also taught a little bit of Latin as well. So the reason I'm doing this workshop is because many parents have expressed some concerns to me over the years, especially as of late, because there's scholarship exams coming up about how to become better at creative writing. Now, creative writing seems like a very challenging sort of area because obviously it's creative, it's subjective, it's open to interpretation. It's not as black and white as maths. But today I wanted to give everyone a little bit of clarity on what the expectations are for creative writing, how we can develop our creative writing skills from early age, and what we should expect going into the future. I know there are some people here who are actually already in middle school or high school, and there'll be some content in there for you as well. This is more of a general, how do we approach creative writing throughout our schooling? Now, I'll start with some very basic things. Don't worry too much. I'm just covering the basics for people who maybe aren't familiar, and then we'll move on to the more advanced content. So firstly, what is creative writing? Now, for students especially, so in a student context or young writers, as you all are, creative writing is almost always associated with a stimulus. Now, obviously, some of you might do writing for a hobby and you might do it in your spare time. And obviously in that context, you're not writing to a particular stimulus. But generally speaking, all students or young writers, when they're entering competitions, when they're doing things for exams, when they're writing for their school assignments, you'll always be given a stimulus. Now, as I'm sure those of you who are in my writing class know, the stimulus is kind of like the question posed to you for any piece of writing. I'm sure you all have done a bit of persuasive writing in the past, questions, for example, like, that school uniform should be banned. Well, you can think of the stimulus as the question you have to answer for a piece of creative writing. The key takeaway is the stimulus has to be the main idea of your imaginative, creative, or narrative piece of writing. So, like I say here on my slide, students have to write to the stimulus and they have to really base their narrative or themes around it, right? You have to think of it like a question. Now, this might seem really basic or really established, but actually from every age, from right at the start of primary school, when you start doing creative writing, all the way through to the end of the HSC, you'll actually be getting almost exactly the same types of stimuluses. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. They can come in different forms, like I've written here. The most common is a picture, but sometimes you'll also get sentences, words, or story starters. Has anyone here gotten the story starter stimulus before? If they give you a sentence, for example, and you have to kind of start the story with that sentence, or your character has to say it at some point, you'll get stimuluses like that all throughout your schooling. Now, as you can see on my next slide, here are examples from the 2 most recent HSC exams. And I know lots of you are very, very far away from the HSC, okay? Some of you are more than 6 years away from the HSC. But as you can see, even during that final exam of your high school, you're still getting the same types of stimulus, right? Can everyone see that? For example, right up the top, question 9 says, compose a piece of imaginary writing that begins with these words, right? This is like a story starter, a sentence type stimulus. For question 3, down the bottom, this is from last year's HSC. That's more of a traditional story type stimulus where you're given a picture and you have to, compose a piece of imaginary writing based on that particular picture. Can everyone see that? Now, I'm pretty sure those of you who are in primary school are familiar with these sorts of stimuluses already. In fact, some of you might be able to even write stories on these stimuluses without much challenge, right? They don't look much harder than the ones you already have. So the whole point is creative writing generally for students is always based on stimulus, even if it's in a non-academic context like competitions. Speaking of competitions, let's talk quickly about when creative writing is actually examined. Now, when we say examined, I don't necessarily mean for an exam. I'm just saying when a student's really expected to write creative writing, in what sorts of context and age groups. Like I've written here, creative writing is examined in many different contexts, like I said, from primary school all the way through to university. Even if you choose to study writing in university, you're still writing creatively and often to a stimulus. When it comes to an academic context, students are expected to write creative stories almost every year for school. Now, this might be for your exams. It might be for something like I've listed there for NAPLAN. It could be a school assignment or a class that you're doing, especially in high school when you have a proper English class or English periods. You will be asked to write creatively more often than not, at least once, if not 2 or 3 times a year, and hand it into the teacher for marking. But of course, there's also other contexts in which you're writing. Like I've listed here, you could be writing, for example, for selective or scholarship exams, for ICAS, for HSC, for NAPLAN, or even a independent competition like the New South Wales Write On competition. Has anyone actually entered the Write On competition before? I know some schools do it. Okay, I can see Troy has. Also, of course, the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Okay, some schools also do those sorts of competitions. And even in those cases, you have stimulus, right? You have some kind of way of responding to a particular question or responding to a particular picture or theme that they give you. So as you can see, because you're doing creative writing all the way throughout, all the way, from early age all the way through to university, we really need to get a good grasp of creative writing from an early year, an early grade. Okay, this is going to be the most substantive part of my presentation, which is we're going to talk a little bit about how creative writing is assessed, right? What makes a piece of creative writing good? What makes it something that is successful? What makes it something that might win a prize at a competition or a writing competition? Or what's something that would get a good mark when it comes to, say, a scholarship exam or a school assignment, right? I'm not just limiting myself to exams. We're looking at creative writing in general. Now, like I said, in all the contexts where students are doing creative writing, they're always looked at with some kind of guideline or marking criteria or rubric, as I've said there. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar or have seen writing or marking rubrics before. Is that correct? They look like a kind of like a little table, right? They have marks. We're going to look at some later. Don't worry about that. But they're almost always assessed to this kind of table or rubric. Now, what a rubric is it guides the judges sometimes, or the teachers or the markers who are looking at your piece of writing. It helps them assess whether a piece of writing is good or not. So each guideline will set out a couple of things that the person is looking for. Now, while most criteria or most rubrics are very similar, they have some small differences. Most of them have the same expectations of students, right? They're really asking you to do the same sorts of things. Now, I've identified 5 key features I've written here, which are almost common across all marking rubrics for creative writing, whether or not it's for a creative competition or it's for an exam or it's for school. Those things are 1, engagement with the stimulus. So that pretty much means, have you actually answered the question? Have you responded to the stimulus? Use of language. So that includes things like, is your vocabulary good? Is your punctuation correct? Do you have any grammar errors? Appropriateness of structure and form. So that means, is your story paced well? Is it a bit messy? Are things all over the place? Or do you have some events that are clearly laid out that drive the narrative along? Do you have an engaging style? So style, when we talk about creative writing, means, are you writing in a way that is exciting or interesting? Are you mixing up your sentence structure? Are you describing things in detail and really engaging the audience? Finally, we also have character and setting. So obviously we know in our short stories, we should always have a main character. Well, is that character fleshed out? Do they have a strong personality? And also the setting, right? Is that environment really detailed? Is it something that we can imagine ourselves in? Now let's have a look at some of the most common marking criteria in creative writing. We're going to be looking at a few from many different contexts, but let's start right at the very top. This comes from the most recent HSC exam in year 12. So this is the exact marking criteria that all teachers across the state used to mark the piece of writing in module C. You're not going to understand what that is, but you'll understand it later. But essentially, children had to write a piece of creative writing based on a stimulus. Now, let's go back. As you can see, right at the very top, you have the top band, marks 10 to 12. And if we look at the dot points, we can see some of the features that I just talked about. Okay, it says it concludes with the stimulus. Okay, so does it use the stimulus extensively? It uses a range of language to create an engaging piece of writing. And does it use structure appropriate to audience, purpose, context, and selected form? Can everyone see that? Right at the top, right? So that's the HSC marking guideline. That's fine. That's just one example though. Let's have a look at another one. This one's a little more complicated. It's from ICAS. Who has done an ICAS exam before? I'm sure some of you have. Okay, good. Lots of people have. This is what teachers from ICAS, or the markers at ICAS, use to mark or grade their particular stories. Now, as we can see, they grade on a much more vague scale. They use 4 sections: genre, textual grammar, syntax, and punctuation. But if ever I could direct everyone's attention to the bottom left of the screen where it says genre, can everyone see that? Now let's have a look at that paragraph. Genre assesses the ways in which the text has been structured and specific stylistic and vocabulary choices that have been made to achieve the writer's purpose and engagement of the reader. The best text will demonstrate a creative and skillful integration of structure and language choices in order to do this. And of course, the rest of the other 4 sections also have to do with just writing. Okay, so is your grammar good? Is your punctuation correct? And is your spelling, does it have any mistakes or not? So that's ICAS. Those of you who don't know what ICAS is, it's kind of an independent exam you can do. Some schools do it. They offer you to do it in some primary schools and high schools. You don't necessarily have to do it. It's more of an opt-in. Okay, let's have a look at ASA. Now, if you don't know who ASA are, ASA does more than half of the scholarship exams in New South Wales. Okay, so they're responsible for, let's say you're going for a scholarship exam. Put your hand up if you're doing one of those, maybe end of this year or start of next year. I'm sure a lot of you are, at different private schools, let's say like Sydney Grammar or Pymble, or all those sorts of private schools, right? ASA, they're responsible for writing most of those exams or a large proportion of them. Now, ASA says on their website that when they're marking creative writing, if everyone looks under content and narrative, it says ability to develop a storyline, character development, and control of writing style. Okay, so as we can see, even the private schools, when they're setting their particular writing sections for their exams, they're also looking for a lot of things. They're looking for, like I said, characters. They're looking for language. They're looking for some kind of coherent narrative that drives forward. Of course, AAS also does scholarship exams. So someone sent me a question about that. Unfortunately, AAS doesn't release their marking criteria online. Okay, that's a private thing. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to find that, but I did find ACES. Let's look at NAPLAN's one. I'm sure you've all done NAPLAN because it's compulsory. But as you can see, there are 10 dot points there that they're looking for. Can everyone see that? 10 different dot points. Now, I want to point something out to you. Hopefully everyone can see my annotations on screen. Now, under ideas, 5 marks are allocated to ideas. Can everyone see that? And ideas is the creation, selection of crafting of ideas for a narrative. However, there are tons of marks allocated to other things as well. As we can see, 6 marks are allocated for audience, which is the capacity to engage and affect the reader. A further 4 marks are allocated for cohesion, which is, like I said, the control of multiple threads and relationships over the whole text, words, associations, etc. There's also a mark for text structure, and there's also marks for vocab, character, and setting. Can everyone see that? So my whole point is they're not looking for just ideas, right? They're looking for something much broader than simply your ideas. They're looking for a lot of different things all at once, including language, including spelling, including character and setting, our relationships, have we described things in enough detail, etc. Let's have a look at one more marking guideline. And this one is actually not for an exam or in an academic context, but it's the New South Wales Write On competition. Okay, so this is doesn't have anything to do with schools or exams. There's another marking criteria altogether from a different context. This one from a competition. Now, even a writing competition asks for very similar things. Can everyone see that? It says makes connections to the stimulus image. So we have to use the stimulus well. It says engages the audience, has a consistent structure appropriate for the type, okay, includes age appropriate content, and considers the purpose, audience, and context. So let's have a quick look again. From all of these different marking criteria across all sorts of different contexts and ages, all of them feature very similar demands. Does everyone agree? Can everyone see that? Yeah, very similar, right? So really what makes a piece of good creative writing is not just how you interpret a stimulus or what sorts of ideas you put in. It's a much broader set of considerations. So what do students actually need to develop? Now, I think there's a little bit of a misconception that creative writing is just about assessing creativity. Okay, it's just about assessing creativity. It's how out there, how outlandish, how creative can you be? But as we saw from the previous, all the different guidelines, whether it's for a competition or for school, it actually is more about skill and it's more about craft. It's not just about your ideas, but it's your ideas matched with your writing ability. So it's a combination of a lot of different elements that go beyond just your idea. Now, even if we think of art, even if we think of visual art, right? The best paintings aren't just which paintings have the best ideas, but which paintings are executed the best, right? So has the painter shown you a particular, mastery of their paintbrush when they painted the painting? Well, similar for us when we're writing a piece of creative writing, even though it's creative, it's more than just about your imagery or your ideas. It's also about your skill and your craft. Now, I've identified over the course of my teaching a few things that some students often neglect when it comes to writing a really successful and high-marking creative writing story. Now, these 5 elements are: 1, writing believable and relatable characters. So students often neglect to really give a lot of detail, personality, and flair to their character. Number 2 is using appropriate tone and style. So have we written in a way that suits the stimulus and suits what we're writing? So making sure we're not writing only action sentences and really short, stuttery sentences, but mixing it up a bit with, descriptions, etc. Number 3 is having a cohesive structure which paces the narrative. Now, I'm not talking about structure in terms of persuasive structure, right? Not all creative writing or pieces of creative writing need to have the same structure. Not all of them need to be, follow an exact flow of events every single time. What I mean by structure is, are the events in the story, pushing the narrative along? Does it hang too long on one particular event, which is obviously, not recommended? You don't want to waste too much time on one particular part of the story, say like your orientation, but you want something that kind of moves forward, that pushes a narrative, that drives a narrative. So does it have a driving sort of structure? Finally, the last 2 points, they're very similar. Does your story have a compelling complication and a satisfying resolution? Now, what I mean by compelling complication is, it's a complication that isn't too cliched. So for example, a really cliched complication might be, oh, I'm running in a running race and I really want to win. I really want to lift that trophy. And then right on the finish line, I managed to overtake the person coming in first place, and then I win, right? So as long as it's not a really cliched complication, does it have a compelling and interesting one? And also a satisfying resolution. So does your character develop and learn something from the experience, right? Most stories don't just end when the complication ends. Most stories have a next chapter, which shows us how the character has grown from that particular experience. Now, here is the judges' feedback from last year's New South Wales Write On competition. Can everyone see that? So once again, Write On competition is a government, it's a state competition for young writers. There's lots of prizes to be won, and the government runs it every year. Now, this is the judges' feedback, and it gives some suggestions of what students should be doing. Can everyone see that? Can everyone see my screen? Cool. So it gives some suggestions about what students should be doing. So what that means is probably a lot of the entries they received for the Write On competition last year didn't do these things well. So let's have a look at what some students should have done instead. And I think it reinforces what I said just then. So the first point up the top, can everyone see that? It says, avoiding the overuse of descriptive language, in particular figurative language, making the writing unwieldy and difficult to follow. So a lot of students tend to over-describe things, okay? Sometimes an entire story that's 500 words long can just be a marvelous landscape. And that's fine if you wanted to write a description that was really detailed, but unfortunately a story is more than just description, okay? It needs a kind of narrative. As you can see here, some students also didn't make the stimulus, the image, central to their piece of writing, so that's why they've suggested that. They've also suggested to ensure the writing suits the purpose, audience, and context. So that's kind of writing in an appropriate form. So have they used the right style? Are they writing too informally or formally? A really interesting point down the very bottom is developing a storyline that does not delve into issues beyond the maturity or age group of the author. Now, we're going to talk about that a bit later. Keep that in your mind. We're going to discuss what that means a little bit later and why some competitions or markers are looking for that. And finally, down the bottom, it says using verbs to describe the emotions and feelings of the characters, right? So that means not to tell emotions, but to show them. Okay, so if you wanted to tell an emotion, it would be something like Jim was sad. But what the markers suggest, what the judges for this competition suggest was, well, you should be using verbs, right? So a single tear flowed down Jim's cheek as he let out a deep and wistful sigh or something like that, right? But that's kind of what they're suggesting. So as we can see, creative writing is not just about ideas and description, right? It's much broader. There's a lot of elements that you need to throw in. But with that in mind, let's move on to the second main topic of our workshop today. We have to talk about limitations. Now, give me 1 second. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water. Okay, we have to talk about limitations. Now, limitations are things that the stimulus or the general, whatever you're writing for, puts onto you that limits how free you can be. Now, if you're writing in your spare time, I know some of you are even writing short novellas or you've wanted to write a novel. Is that correct? Put up your hand if you want to write something in the future, maybe a bit more long form, or yeah, some of you do, lots of you are interested in doing that. So if you're writing long form, you don't have many limitations, right? You're not writing to a stimulus. You can write as long as you want. You could even write an entire book series if you have, the dedication for it. And I'm sure some of you will end up writing books in the future. However, when it comes to the types of things that students write outside of their spare time, so like I said, for their school, perhaps for exams, or for creative competitions or clubs, writing clubs, things like that, you're always given limitations, things that limit how free you can be when you're actually writing. Now, there are usually 3 limitations imposed by all these sorts of different contexts in which you're doing creative writing. The first one, which you've already briefly discussed, is the stimulus. The second one is a time limit. Sometimes you're given a time limit. And thirdly, sometimes you're also given a word count. Now, these 3 limitations, they do different things to what you can do. The stimulus limits what you can write about, and I've bolded what there, right? Because you have to write to the stimulus, you have to answer that question, you have to make that the main idea. It effectively limits what your story can be about. Does everyone see what I'm trying to say? Right? It narrows you in, right? You have to answer the stimulus, you have to write to the stimulus, so narrows it in a little bit. The time limit, when you're given one, which you're not always given one, but the time limit limits how much you can write. Obviously, if you're only given 30 minutes, I would say most fast writers could only probably write by hand around 500 to 600 words if they were really speeding, okay? Most people of your age, of early middle school and early primary school ages, usually you're only writing about maybe 450 to 500 words at most in 30 minutes, okay? So really time limits are limiting how much you can write. Now, a word count limits the scope of your story. We're going to talk a little bit more about scope later, but scope essentially means how broad your story can be. Has anyone heard of the word scope before? I'm sure you have, right? The word scope is how broad the story can be. What sorts of events can you include? What sorts of things can you discuss? How much detail should we be putting in each section of our story? That's the scope, right? How wide a story can be. Let's deal with each of these limitations one by one. Okay, the first is dealing with the stimulus. Now, as I mentioned right at the very start of my presentation, the stimulus should be the main idea of your story. Now, what do we mean by main idea? So some students often get this wrong. They don't get it quite, or they don't hit the nail quite on the head. When we talk about main idea, we mean that it has to be used in layers. It has to be incorporated in different ways, not just in a single way. So some students, for example, when they see an image, they might include the image at some point in their story as, say, a little aside, as a bit of figurative language. Maybe in one scene, the picture will show up like it's an object, like a key. Maybe some students will talk about a key at the very start and then move on to something else. But as I've noted here, a lot of markers and judges for competitions, they really care about whether or not you've written very deeply on the stimulus. And to write deeply about the stimulus, we have to be using it in different layers, in different ways. Now, I've suggested 4 layers in which you could incorporate a stimulus on this slide. The first is you could use it as your main setting, right? So if you were given a picture of a lighthouse, you should probably set your story on that lighthouse if you wanted to incorporate it that way, right? I'm not saying all stories with a picture of a lighthouse have to be set on a lighthouse. You could obviously use it metaphorically as well, which is my second dot point. You can use it as a symbol for your story's themes, right? So let's think of a lighthouse. A lighthouse is, a tower that guides ships in the dark away from storms and onto land. So maybe you could think about, what does a lighthouse represent as a symbol? Maybe a guide in the dark, something that guides people away from being lost. Maybe someone who helps out someone who's feeling confused, right? That would be a metaphorical interpretation of that stimulus. You could also use the stimulus as a piece of figurative language or a repeated motif throughout your story. Say, for example, you could refer to someone as your lighthouse, right? Let's say you have a really good friend who always is there to give you advice, and your story is about that, how this friend has gotten you out of trouble a lot of times by giving you really sound but harsh advice. Well, maybe you could say, James is my lighthouse, and you talk about your relationship with him, right? How you became friends, something like that. Or of course, you could also use it as context for your main character's background, right? So maybe say a lighthouse played an important role in who the character is as a person today in your story, right? It's this major part of their history, right? Maybe their parents worked on a lighthouse, so they had to become used to how that sort of place worked and what working in a lighthouse was like. Or maybe they grew up next to a lighthouse and always saw it as a place of wonder, a sort of marvelous human achievement. Something like that. Now, I'm just giving you examples. Obviously, they're not the only interpretations, but the point I'm trying to make is you need to be using the stimulus in a layered way. Does everyone understand what I'm trying to say? A layered way. Can't just be used in a single way or appear just once. You kind of have to use it really deeply and comprehensively in different ways, all at the same time. That's how you succeed when there's a stimulus. Now, the next topic is dealing with word count and time. Now, this is a really controversial topic, so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this. Now, the first thing we have to understand about word count and time is that they're inherently linked together. They're pretty much the same thing. Why? Because if you're given a time limit, you're actually being given a word count broadly as well. Does that make sense? because obviously most people can only write a certain number of words in a certain number of time. Now, you might be an absolute speed demon of a writer, and congratulations. Yeah, you're very lucky to be able to have that skill. But I would say on average, very fast writers will only be able to write the amount of words that I've listed here on screen. Now, just for context, me in the HSC, in about 40 minutes, I was writing about 800 to 900 words, and I was really speeding along. So generally, fast writers should be, aiming to write about this many words in a given time limit. So 20 to 30 minutes, I would say around 400 to 500 words is really, really strong. 30 to 40 minutes, I would be looking more at 700 to 800, and then 60 minutes or above, 1,000 to 1,200. Of course, most of you are only going to be writing in the 20 to 40 minute range. Most of you are actually only writing in the 20 to 30 minute range for competitions or for exams or for school assignments, right? So the whole point is time limit and word count are linked. And word count, recall from a couple of slides ago, word count is intimately linked with the scope of your story. Now, the whole point is the lower the word count, the narrower the scope of your story has to be. So the lower the word count, the less words you can actually write, the narrower the scope. Now, what does scope mean? As I kind of introduced a couple of slides ago, scope is comprised of, could be things like the number of characters or events, right? So are there lots of characters? Is there lots of things happening? Or is it just kind of one focused event? The amount of background information. Are you writing a really extensive background story, introducing your character all the way from them they were born all the way till their death, or writing this massive biography? Or the level of detail you put into your description, right? Are you writing really long and florid descriptions that are hundreds of words long? Now, let me tell you now, if you have a story that has a narrow scope, do you think you can do a ton of characters? Probably not. Can you put in a ton of events if you have a low word count? No. Can you put in a ton of background information if you have a lot of word count? Not really, right? Can you put in a ton of detail into your description if you have a low word count? Probably not as well. So word count really actually is probably the biggest influence on our story apart from our stimulus, right? It's the biggest influence on sort of what we need to be focusing on and what we're writing about. So let's deal with this topic, okay? This is a very difficult topic to get through to especially students. Now, I just wanted to mention that the things that I put on screen here do not apply to you writing in your own spare time or you doing writing for leisure or creativity by yourself, okay? If you want to write a novel, that's fine. You can write about whatever you want. It can be as long as you want, and it can be about any topic. But most of us will be writing for schools, for exams, and for competitions on a very narrow scope. Now, put your hand up if you wrote for the write-on competition already. Some of you have, right? Some of you have done write-on before. Now, the write-on competition is limited to 500 words. Everyone remember that? 500, right? That's a very narrow scope. Lots of exams, let's say for scholarship, you're given 20 to 30 minutes, so you can only write about 400 to 500 words. Even for NAPLAN, you're given a very short time limit as well, right? And you can only write, a few hundred words. So most of the work that we'll be writing outside of our leisure or our free time, they will be what we call narrow scope stories. Okay, stories that have a narrow scope, stories where we can't explore really large and developed worlds with lots of characters and events and massive things happening. So as we saw from the judges' feedback from the write-on competition from a few slides ago, if you match a broad scope with a low word count, it can result in disaster. Now, what do I mean by broad scope? Like I said before, maybe your story has a massive cast of characters, right? 10 characters, 5 or 6 characters. Maybe the story takes place across 10 years of events. Maybe the story is about something, like a sci-fi or a fantasy world where there's lots of new terms and inventions and things you have to introduce to the reader. Maybe your story is about a historical event, right? those are examples of stories with really broad scopes, right? Because the story is about a lot of things at once. But if you have a low word count, you can't really write a story that has a really broad scope, because it can result in, like I've listed here, too much unnecessary description, lack of focus, no real compelling narrative events, so maybe the story gets a little bit lost, it's quite vague or confusing. And finally, you could get really shallow and unrealistic characters, right? Characters who are called Max or Judy or James, but they don't really do anything, right? They don't feel like real human beings because, of course, they don't really have much personality. You don't have the words to put it in. Now, the following dot point is a recommendation, and it's my wholehearted, sincere recommendation that when you're writing a story with a narrow scope, with a low word count, so that's in situations like competitions, like you're writing for a writing festival, you're writing for an exam or a school assignment or a scholarship test, anything where you're given a narrow scope, where you're given a word limit, you should try to avoid the following types of stories. Now, the reason for this is, and I'll explain this a little bit on my next slide, these stories tend to have quite broad scope. So the first type is stories about violent or traumatic circumstances like war. I know lots of students like to write about massive field battles and things like that. But of course, it's very difficult to write a story about massive field battles, because when wars happen, they happen for lots of different reasons. They happen for political reasons. They happen for geographical reasons. They happen for many complex years of history that you're simply not going to be able to capture in a 500-word story. Similarly, when it comes to things like mental illness, lots of students sometimes write stories about people who are depressed or even commit suicide. Now, I highly recommend against writing a story like that, because that is a really heavy topic with a very broad scope. And you run the risk of treating it in quite an offensive or a too light of a way. Okay, so be really careful about writing about mental illness. Be also careful about writing about famous historical events, and lots of students tend to write about things like the Holocaust. Now, while it is a worthy thing to be writing about, when you only have 20 to 30 minutes and 500 words, do you really think you can capture the detail and the history necessary to write or do that topic justice? Lots of markers that I've talked to when students write about these famous historical events have complained that students are writing too naively. Okay, they're almost writing in an offensive way because they haven't really tried to convey what that history is in a really sensitive and understanding way. Now, most controversially, I don't think you should be writing science fiction or fantasy, and this is just my recommendation. Okay, there's nothing stopping you from doing it, but I strongly recommend that you don't write science fiction and fantasy in a story with limited scope. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Now, on the left, we have 4 very famous science fiction or fantasy series. Okay, we have Dune. I don't know if any of you have seen that in the new Dune film or read any of Frank Herbert's Dune. We have The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I'm sure lots of you have read or seen those films. Of course, bottom left, everyone's heard of it, Harry Potter, right? I'm sure lots of you have read it. And on the bottom right, a very famous Japanese fantasy series called Berserk. Now, when it comes to these series, what can we tell? What can we tell about all of them? They are massive. Can everyone see that? Especially something like Berserk, right? It's like 40 books long, okay? Even Dune is massive, right? Lord of the Rings is massive. Harry Potter comes in a whole chest because it's so massive. Now, of course, not all science fiction and fantasy novels are this lengthy, but I've just picked out some of the most famous examples of lengthy works, right? Because they're, probably some of the most famous science fiction or fantasy works ever. Now, why do you think famous science fiction or fantasy works are lengthy? Well, it's because the author has to build up a new world in front of you, right? Do any of you live in the world of Harry Potter? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Do any of you live in the world of Lord of the Rings? Obviously not. Do any of you live on the planets in outer space that are talked about in Dune? Also, no. Now, what does that mean? It means that you're unfamiliar with the world that these authors are creating, right? They're taking you, they're picking you up off of Earth and putting you in some completely alien and unfamiliar environment. So they have to do this thing called world building, right? They have to provide you with lots of context, how the world came to be this way, how things work in this world, what are the politics like, what are all the structures like, etc. Now, we as student writers, when we're given a limited scope, it's very, very exceptionally difficult, almost impossible to do this in 500 words, right? It's simply almost impossible to do this in 500 words. That's not to say you can't have shorter science fiction or fantasy works, but when you're in an exam, let's say, or in a competition, and you're given a stimulus and 500 words, it is very difficult to pull off somehow building a world that we're intrigued by and having a strong character, having great language and description, having a compelling narrative that with a satisfying complication and resolution, all in 500 words. You're really biting off too much you can chew. And as we saw from the Write-On competition feedback from last year, students who tried to tackle stories that were beyond their maturity, their age group, or inappropriate for the context and the form that was being asked to write were penalized, right? They weren't students who ended up winning the prizes in that particular writing competition. So let's come to a conclusion. Now, recall from when we looked at all the writing rubrics ages ago, okay, about 10 slides ago, that your story should always be appropriate for the context, age group, and audience. What that means, what all those rubric means, okay, what that particular line is trying to get at is really students should be writing about relatable life experiences. Yeah, they should be appropriate for the age group and the audience and the context that you're writing in. They're not expecting you or asking you to write about the Holocaust. They're not expecting you to write about really dramatic, bloody, violent wars, space battles, aliens, things like that. Now, some students, when they hear this, they throw their hands up and they say, oh, I can only write boring stories. I hate writing boring stories. Oh, life experiences are really boring. Okay, sure. Some of them are, but it doesn't mean that we can't come up with stories that are nevertheless engaging and successful. Remember from when we looked at all those marking rubrics, as long as our stories have strong characters, an engaging narrative, almost all of them use the word engaging, if you recall that, and they're somehow relatable, aka appropriate for context and appropriate for audience, they will be successful. No matter if it's for a competition to win a prize, a scholarship to get into a school, right? A school exam, we want to get the best mark, etc. Now, I've included 5 ideas here of some successful stories you could write in a narrow scope. Now, remember, I just want to repeat myself, you can write whatever you want in your free time. You can write a whole novel about science fiction, or 10 if you really wanted to. You could write the next big thing. You could be the next J.K. Rowling if you really wanted. But when you're only given 500 words and you're only given a stimulus and a really narrow scope, I really highly recommend that to be successful, it's much, much more effective to think about creative ways which we could write about life experiences rather than going straight to aliens and magic and death and bombs. For example, some things you could write about are, like I said here, social or domestic conflicts. Okay, so your relationship that you have with friends or family, maybe you and your best friend are having an argument over something. How are you going to resolve that, right? How are you going to get on the same side again? Maybe you could write about current world events that are relatable. So instead of writing about something like, I don't know, the Holocaust or a world war, you could write about the pandemic. All of us can relate to the pandemic, right? Maybe you could write about how, say, your family's business has become really challenged by lockdown. So how do you support your parents through their difficult financial times? What can you do? You could write about internal struggles. That's my third suggestion. Internal struggles meaning, is there something within us that's making us uncomfortable, right? Something that we need to get used to. Perhaps you could write a story, and we're going to see in our case study, a story about someone who immigrates to a new country. How do they deal with that experience, right? How do they come to terms with this new place that they're not familiar with? Perhaps your story could be about, suggestion number 4, dealing with unexpected change. So let's say your character, is a doctor, or your character is some sort of person with a particular set of skills. What if they're suddenly put in a different environment or different situation where they have to exercise their skills in a way that they're not used to? Let's say your character is a medical student who's studying medicine at university. And then on the first day of working in a hospital, they get placed in the emergency room and they're overwhelmed with cases. They get to see for the first time what being a doctor is truly about. And they get overwhelmed. Well, how do they deal with that? Are they successful? What do they learn from that, really intense experience? Finally, suggestion number 5, you could write about universal human experiences. What I mean by universal is things that everyone goes through, things that we can all relate to. For example, like I said here, and most of you won't have this yet because you're actually all children still, right? And you're not quite adults yet. But one example could be, say, the nostalgia that a lot of people feel about childhood. A lot of people feel about being a teenager, how they've now got a full-time job and they really, it really sucks being an adult, and they reminisce about, their childhood lives and being a teen and things like that. How do they get over that, right? How do they come back, onto track and stay focused in their endeavors as an adult? So as we can see, we don't need to exaggerate and push out and write about unrealistic or violent or, really fantastical scenarios that you might find in a historical novel or a war novel or a crime novel or a science fiction or fantasy novel, right? We can do really interesting, successful and engaging stories just about our life experiences. So let's have a quick look at a case study. Now, this case study comes from a year 10 student who is a student of mine who scored full marks in their recent school test for creative writing. Okay, full marks, 15 out of 15 for this particular story. Now, as we can see, this story is really limited in scope. It has a really narrow scope. Why? Let's read the stimulus together. Right, the stimulus was, write an imaginative piece set in an Australian landscape. Use this setting to explore a particular aspect of the Australian experience. The word count given to them was 750 to 800 words. Now, 3 elements about this immediately stand out of the stimulus, right? These are the things that we have to make our main idea. 1, it has to involve an Australian setting or an Australian landscape. So what immediately comes to mind when we think Australian landscape? Maybe it's the bush, it's the outback, right? It's the mountain ranges and the really flat lands, really dry and arid climate. The experience also has to be written about something particularly Australian. So something sort of unique to Australia, right? Something that Australians would undergo in specific. The story also must be narrow in scope. Everyone recall what I talked about for scope a few minutes ago? So it can't be too broad. It can't feature a lot of different things going at once. How do we know it has to be narrow in scope? Well, the word count, 750 to 800. It's not much. Okay, it's about 1 A4 page if you're counting based on like typing, right? So it's really not very long at all. Certainly not as long as a novella or even a book. So let's have a quick read of this story together. Another bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. Swiping at his clammy cheeks with the grime-stained sleeve of his rain jacket, Ming tugged absent-mindedly at the thread sprouting from a loose seam. Preoccupied as he was with his coat, he didn't notice the arched tree root that caught his shoe and sent him flying into the loamy dirt. As he scrabbled around in the mulch for his glasses under clumps of leaf litter and squelchy grey moss, he didn't even try to suppress the sigh that arose from him. Just over a month ago, he had been weaving through market stalls packed with wandering tourists with his classmates. No, friends, folding paper airplanes and playing at pilots racing through the skies. Just over a month ago, he had been feasting on the pineapple cakes and soothing tea his mother always laid out on the table of their humble apartment. Just over a month ago, he had been home under a radiant red flag embellished with gold stars. Now he was here, drenched in the miserable, humid weather of peak Australian summer, stranded amidst a dense prison of vegetation. Ming had seen forests in China before, near towers of long, spindly green, threaded with sinewy bamboo that blanketed the long expanse of mountain ranges. The rainforests in Australia couldn't even begin to live up to that, not with their haphazard cluttering of shrubs, the trees and leaves bursting out of every surface. A dense canopy loomed ominously over the belly of the forest, only letting through brief splatters of sunshine that were quickly smothered by the brown-leafed plants underneath. It was messy, different, unwelcoming. To make things worse, this forest was one filled with raucous classmates. Having summoned the strength to push himself off the ground, Ming glanced warily at the groups of classmates giggling amongst themselves, eyes darting to meet his before the whispering grew even more vigorous. As he drifted over to the group, he steeled his nerves and braced himself for the pity and distaste sure to be lingering in their eyes. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the floor, trying to pretend he hadn't just severely embarrassed himself in front of all his new classmates. Ming, are you all right? That fall looks super painful. Cocking his head upwards, he stared puzzledly at a boy whose name he couldn't quite recall fell into pace beside him, while another girl peered at his knees for scrapes or bruises. He was lucky the ground had been soft after the rain. He managed to gather from her animated expression, nodding when he hoped was appropriate. She didn't seem to mind, though, eagerly herding him along with the group as they continued on their expedition to the lookout. It was nice, he thought. He'd expected the worst before the events had even occurred, assuming all his peers would steer clear of him because of his accent, because he was new, different. Ever since they'd moved to Australia, he dreaded interacting with others because it seemed so evident how much he stuck out, like a soft baby panda in a bone-dry desert. But in spite of all of these things, he realized his classmates were still smiling and laughing with him instead of at him. For the small kindnesses they had shown, Ming felt himself shyly grinning along, the tips of his ears flushing scarlet as they marched along the path. A few hundred wooden steps later, brighter sun finally began to peek through the thinning foliage. The sight invigorated them all, and Ming was swept along in a surge of bodies as the class burst past lines of unfurling vines and leaning trees through the path where he was met with blue. Rich blue flooded his senses as he gazed, awestruck, over the roof of the vibrant emerald treetops. He stood as a tiny speck gazing atop the crown of ancient trees, enamored with the silhouette of minuscule birds imprinted against the stark azure backdrop. As a cooling breeze swept through the treetops, now unfettered by the dense undergrowth and carrying instead the scent of rain, a bite of eucalypt, Ming could not help but smile as the pure, untouched serenity of the Australian rainforest soothed some of the agitation within him. It no longer seemed to matter if he was a foreigner, nor if his classmates beside him had been born here. In this moment, they were all simply children in awe of the land beneath them. It would be a while, Ming knew, before his heart would be fully able to accept this strange new country as his home. But perhaps if there was any place in the world that could thaw it out, it would be under the persistent Australian sun. Okay, now this story is obviously a little bit longer than most primary school students are expecting. You're expecting to write about maybe 75% or maybe 60% of that length when you're actually writing your story. But that was a story that was written with a very narrow scope and to a particular stimulus. Now, what do we notice about that story? I thought that story, the reason it got full marks in a school, and this was a top private school in Sydney as well, why did it get such a good mark, full marks? First of all, it comprehensively dealt with the stimulus, right? So I've here highlighted a couple of things, as you can see. Remember, the stimulus was set in an Australian landscape that dealt with a particularly Australian experience. Now, what is that experience? Bushwalking, right? Hiking in Australia. That's a particularly Australian experience set in an Australian landscape. Not many people go bushwalking in other countries, trust me, right? It's a very Australian activity. And the whole thing is about someone who was going bushwalking as part of a school activity, a school excursion. As we can see on this slide, there are many descriptions of this, bushland, this messy, crowded, brown bushland that we're all so familiar with in Australia. Now, if we go back and have a look, right, It's set in a realistic situation, but it's still engaging and relatable. This person, didn't choose to write a really extreme event, a really violent event, a war perhaps. They wrote about someone moving countries, right? Someone who had moved from China to Australia and, had entered primary school, going on this excursion, feeling nervous. Because of that, they put a lot of emphasis on the character's thoughts and emotions. Does everyone agree? There was quite a great deal of description about that. If we have a look, all throughout the story, there are so many great little descriptions that demonstrate what the character is feeling. They never tell us directly what they're feeling. They never said, Ming was sad, but they're using quite detailed showing descriptions to kind of guide us through this emotional roller coaster. At first, Ming felt really embarrassed. He felt really ashamed of himself that he'd fallen over and made a fool of himself in front of his class. And then he felt accepted. He felt embraced by the community around him. Okay? Obviously, like I said, it deals with the internal struggle of the character. Why? It's a character who is struggling to adjust to immigrating to Australia, right? Someone who doesn't know if they're going to fit in. Doesn't span too much time or contain too many events as appropriate for a story with narrow scope. And it describes its environment in detail, but not excessively. If we keep looking, the internal struggle is really clear. Okay? The bushland very much reflects this character's emotions at the start of the story. Messy, different, unwelcoming. Right? How this character feels about Australia is what he thinks Australians feel about him. All throughout the story as well, we get updates on this internal struggle. How does he feel like he stands? Until finally, right at the very end of the story, we get a very satisfying resolution. Does the character say, I love Australia now, Australia is the best? No, right? Doesn't make a dramatic change. But the character says, despite me being apprehensive, being cautious about this new country, he has a kind of optimism that he'll be able to fit in the end. Can everyone see that? If there was any place in the world that could thaw it out, it would be under the persistent Australian sun. So as we can see, it is very, very, very likely that if you write a really strong narrative with a relatable premise, an engaging narrative, and a strong character, you'll do extraordinarily well. Now let's come to our conclusion. Two more final tiny points to make. Firstly, how can we develop our creative writing skills, right? So we know what we need to do to succeed in different contexts. Well, how do we develop them? The first thing, of course, is to read widely. This is something that I say in almost every single one of my workshops. You need to be reading as much as you can from all sorts of different authors across the world, fiction and nonfiction. You need to be practicing creative writing often. And for those of you who don't enter the Write-On competition, have a go this year, right? It's open every single year. Try to enter the Premier's Literary Awards writing competition. What's the harm? Okay, just enter, have a go, practice, see how far you can push yourself and what sorts of success you can find. Finally, I would also recommend that all students think deeply about underexplored social or personal issues that could be interesting subjects. So it's more than just, I've moved to a new school and I can't find a friend, right? What sorts of other social problems do teenagers deal with? Do you deal with personally that you would want to write about? Lots of us, I'm sure, have conflicts with our parents, right? Have conflicts with our parents who, impose on us certain expectations. I don't see a lot of, pieces of creative writing about that. What are some other social issues that teens might deal with? Maybe pressure from adults to find a good job, to go into a certain career that they don't want to, things like that. If you write a really compelling character in those sorts of contexts, you could have a really good short story. Finally, as something that I've already addressed, like I said, whatever you want to write in your free time, that's totally up to you. If you like science fiction and fantasy, you could write a whole novel. In fact, some of my favorite stories, films, and novels are science fiction. Okay, Philip K. Dick, one of my favorite authors, and Andrei Tarkovsky, one of my favorite directors. All of them work extensively in science fiction. But when you have a story with a really limited scope, so really low word count or low time limit, I'd highly discourage you from writing things like that. But if you are interested in science fiction or fantasy, I would recommend writing something in your own spare time. In fact, when I was little, I tried writing a fantasy novel myself. Didn't quite work out, but it really helped develop my writing, and it helped kind of teach me how to write longer pieces of fiction. Unfortunately, in contexts like competitions or exams or school assignments, you're not going to be able to submit an 800-page masterpiece, right? I think your teachers would find it very bizarre if you handed them the manuscript of Dune as your assignment. So that's my suggestion. Okay, I apologize for running a tiny little bit over time. In fact, we're only 1 minute over because we started at 7:05. It's now 8:06. I will answer questions for about 5 to 10 minutes. So does anyone have any questions? Or if you want to stay for this part, you can. If you don't want to, that's okay as well. But does anyone have any questions? Please keep your hand up. Alice, what's your question? Alice, can you unmute yourself? Oh, sorry. There we go.
I'm about to have NAPLAN, and when I'm planning, what if I can't finish my planning? Do you recommend me to plan while I'm writing, keep on planning, or just write a to be continued thingy?
Okay, really great question. The worst thing you can do in that situation is to not finish your story, right? So you never ever want to end a story that says to be continued, right? Because the marker will think you haven't finished. Does that make sense? Because to be continued, where is the marker going to read the second part? Are you going to mail it to them? You're not, right? So the best thing to do is to, once you're running out of planning time, is to just write, okay? And you need to make sure in your head, you're thinking about where the resolution is, right? You want to make sure that once time is up, you have a resolution on paper, right? That's the most important thing. You need to have a complete narrative on paper, right? Now, if you want to spend 1 more minute just planning, that's fine as well, as long as you can manage the time. But like I said, the most important thing is to get it all completed, right? You don't want to leave it unfinished or have it to be continued. Okay, cool. Eason Shen, question? Oh, whoops, Eason.
Do you recommend writing poems for like tests?
Okay, I do not recommend writing poems for tests because poetry markers are also looking for something quite substantial. So when it comes to writing, they're actually looking for quite a few things, right? They're looking for something quite long, looking for something quite detailed. Poems, while creative, are often very difficult to come up with on the fly, and they're not usually very long, right? So I would highly caution against writing poems, especially when it says short story, right? If it indicates story, then never, ever, ever write a poem, right? But I would highly recommend against writing poems just because it's quite difficult. And also it's very difficult to get the length and the amount of detail and the amount of description that, you know, markers or judges for competitions are expecting. Okay, so you have to write to the format. Okay, Ken from Carlingford, question? No? Okay. Jaden Lee, question?
What do you do when you haven't finished your story and you only have 1 minute left?
Well, you should never be in that situation, okay? You should try your best not to be in that situation by managing your time. But if you haven't managed your time, you need to wrap up your story, right? You need to think on the fly and figure out a way of wrapping it up, right? The worst thing you could do is actually to leave it unfinished, yeah? Because markers will know that it's unfinished. They might, you know, penalize some marks, just a few marks, if, for example, you don't finish with a really satisfying resolution. But as long as you have one, right, it's much better than having a half-finished story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, Jaden Fan has asked me a question. A couple of people have asked me a question, but you can only describe things in the first book. Doesn't that mean only the first book is lengthy? Are you talking about like science fiction and sci-fi and fantasy novel series? Yeah, that makes sense. But we're not writing sci-fi or fantasy novels for a competition, right? So often, yes, the first book will be quite lengthy, and then the other books will be less lengthy because they'll focus more on events, because the first book really has to establish those details. But unless you are planning on writing like a 7-book sci-fi series, which you can if you want, unfortunately, that probably doesn't really apply to us, right? When we're writing short stories. Okay, I'll just take 5 more questions because I know a lot of people need to run off. June, question. No, okay. Rocky, question.
Hi, like for my science fiction module, like we had to write a science fiction text, but like you recommended against it. So like, what if you had to write a science fiction short story?
Well, obviously, if you had to write a science fiction short story, you would have to write a science fiction short story, right? That's a specific module. But I would, even if you're writing a science fiction short story, think about a way to tell that story not in an extremely broad scope. For example, in high school, I also had to do a science fiction module where I had to write a science fiction story. And I wrote that entire story using email. Okay, so I wrote email exchanges between 2 scientists who were inventing, self-aware robots. And over the course of their email exchange, you could tell that something had gone terribly wrong, right? Maybe the robots started acting really weird and they were starting to destroy things or things like that. But it was limited only to these 2 scientists sending messages back and forth. Now, when you write your science fiction story, I would recommend doing that as well. Does that make sense? Because you're not writing Dune, right? You're not writing Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. You're not writing the next Blade Runner. You don't have the time in a school assignment to really flesh out a world. So try to find a micro way of telling a macro story. Does that make sense? Try to find a small way of telling or showing a window into this bigger science fiction world instead of trying to create a world, because you simply can't pull it off in that sort of time. Okay, Andy Wang, question.
So if we are trying to practice creative writing, then where should we get stimuluses from? Or if we want to read books, where can we get, what books should we read?
Good. Okay, so stimuluses are incredibly easy to make up by yourself, because you could just literally write about any image. In fact, if you go on Google Images and you just look up the most popular images, you could just pick a random one and write to that, right? It doesn't really matter. That's kind of what they do anyway for exams and competitions. They pick a random image. Now, if you want to come up with a sentence or word-based stimulus, open your favorite book, look for a random sentence that looks like it would fit, and force yourself to start your story with that particular sentence, right? You can generate infinite stimuluses all by yourself. So it's very easy to find. Okay, sorry about this. Only 3 more questions. Dylan? Question? Dylan Zhang? I can't seem to hear you, Dylan. Could you speak up a little bit? Okay. Let's move on. I think Enya, question?
What is the YouTube channel? Like you said you'll post on YouTube, like what YouTube?
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? There's a lot of background noise, so I can't quite hear you. Okay, let's come back to your question. I'm just going to answer some questions from the chat. So is the after check necessary? So should you check your story after you write it? Definitely should. You should leave about 30 seconds to just go over and have a look at any spelling or grammar mistakes. Some people said, what happens if you don't plan and just write the story as you go? I always recommend spending at least 1 minute planning out the broad outline of your story. Okay, you shouldn't try to make it up on the spot. Even if you just spend 1 minute, okay, writing some quick dot points down, it's really, really, really helpful. Okay, just 2 more questions. Enya, again, let's have another go.
I asked a question on the chat. It was like, what is your YouTube channel about? Because like my mom wants to know.
Oh, what my YouTube channel is. Your parents will get it. Okay, so Cogito will send out a link. So don't worry about that. They'll send out a link in just a second after this is uploaded. Okay, finally, Jaden and then Joy. Those are the last 2 questions, if that's possible. Jaden?
So what is the minimum amount of ideas you recommend for persuasive text?
Okay, that's a question about persuasive. And the minimum amount of paragraphs depends on the amount of time you have, but the minimum is 2, right? The minimum is actually 2. If you have 20 to 30 minutes, 2 body paragraphs that are really long, will probably be fine. I would recommend if you have that much time though, try to go for 3. Okay, but that's more about persuasive, and this was more of a creative workshop. Finally, Joy, question?
What happens if I don't know anything about like the stimulus they give me?
That's a really strange hypothetical question. Have you ever been in that situation where you actually don't know what it is? Okay, in that case, you just need to give it your best go, right? See if you can focus on one particular thing in the stimulus, unless, of course, you just don't recognize what's in the picture at all. Has that ever happened to you, Joy?
No, it's just something I thought of.
Yeah. Because I think that they're not going to give you something which like you're not going to be familiar with. Does that make sense? Because they're not really out there to trick you with the stimulus. They just want to challenge you, right? So they're not going to give you like a picture of a transistor and say, write a story about a transistor, right? Because they know kids aren't going to know that. So you don't have to worry too much about that, but just give it your best go. See if you can identify something in the picture, even if it's a background thing, and just try your best. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming today. And that concludes our presentation.